Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Botanical Biohacking Podcast. Today we have an extraordinary guest. Lori Earley is a licensed acupuncturist and herbalist in Houston, Texas, who specializes in emotional health. With a master's degree in microbiology and a career in the pharmaceutical industry that spanned 9 years, she has been a representative and educator for nearly a dozen psychotropic medications. Lori has a unique perspective when it comes to working with patients who suffer with mental and emotional health concerns, including depression, anxiety, fibromyalgia, and chronic fatigue. Thank you so much for joining us, Lori, and welcome.
Thank you, Andy. I'm so happy to be here.
I was wondering if today we could talk a little bit about epigenetics and how that ties into emotional health.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, let me give you a little bit of background about kind of why I feel this is important and what my journey has to do with that perspective. After college, originally I wanted to go into med school, but instead I went and did a master's degree where I got a master's degree in microbiology, and I worked with electron microscopy. After getting my master's, I was wondering if I wanted to stay in academia or start making some money. I decided to go with the latter, and I went into the pharmaceutical industry. And I thought it would only be for a couple years, but it ended up spanning almost a decade. So that's kind of what brought me into the psychotropic meds, because I worked for Eli Lilly, the Prozac company, and then I worked for several other companies that where I sold medications for bipolar and things like that. What has gotten me into looking at epigenetics specifically for the treatment of emotional health is that the cell itself can tell us so much about how we as human beings, how we are, because the cell is just a microcosm of us, because in reality, we are a petri dish with 50 trillion cells living inside of us. Wow. And so when you look at the way that cells are healthy versus not being healthy, all we have to really look at is looking at the environment. So when you look at the environment that a cell is put in, let's say you put two genetically identical colonies of cells into two different petri dishes, and you put one of the colonies in a petri dish where they're living and growing in a healthy environment, and then you put another genetically identical colony and you put it in a second petri dish, and it's not a healthy environment. There's toxins that are damaging the cells. So it's not the cells there's nothing wrong with the cells, right? Because they're genetically identical. What's wrong is that the environment is creating damage and havoc on the cells and causing disease and early death.
Wow.
So what we know is, since we are 50 trillion cells, then it's the environment that is important. And that has to do with not only what we ingest and what we put onto our skin and, our food and things like that, and the air that we breathe, but also what they're learning is that the cell membrane, when you look at that it's made up of these integral proteins, and it has receptor proteins and effectors. So the receptors are gathering the information outside of the cell and then relaying to the effectors proteins to create a certain behavior within the cell. So these proteins are reacting to different signals from outside the cell to create a different gene expression inside. So we know that it's really the environment that can affect our genes. And the good thing about this is that we are no longer, if we look at it from this perspective, as opposed to the perspective of what you and I were taught in high school and college, and all of us were really taught, is that genes control life. And this new science that's coming out is not true. It's saying that genes don't control life. All they really are is a blueprint.
Mm-hmm.
And that the signals that we receive and the perceptions that we receive really create the behavior of our cells.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it's so important to look at epigenetics versus the genetics that we were taught back in school.
If the environment is toxic, then that will be inherently stressful to a cell. Is there much difference to a cell if it's our own state of stress, which is causing, I guess, those literal stressors on the cell, or
Mm-hmm.
if it's environmental toxicity? Is there much of a difference from the cell's perspective, or is it that, if you're in a toxic emotional environment, it's literally toxic as far as the cells are concerned?
Exactly. Yeah, what they're finding is that it doesn't matter if it's a chemical or an energetic perspective. And the cool thing is, like, not only looking at how the receptors um, are receiving the signals, because they can receive actual chemical compounds,
Mm-hmm.
but they can also receive energetics. So when we are in a stressful emotional situation, there's going to be a different energetic, but there's also going to be different neurotransmitters that are released. So it's
Mm-hmm.
both physiological and an energetic perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, that's the thing is, regardless of what type of toxicity, whether it's food toxicity, air quality, or even an emotional toxicity, it's still going to negatively impact the cells within us.
So what do we do for ourselves after we, have been to the DMV or have been in a situation that is, either boring or stressful or something like this?
So, what we're finding, and this is something I'm sure we all know, is when we are under so much stress, we're putting ourselves into this toxic environment, obviously, but there's ways of getting out of it. And that's kind of going into the HPA axis.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that from, a biological perspective, we have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So our body and our environment, we are supposed to always be running on parasympathetic, which is the
Mm-hmm.
rest and digest, and everything's running smoothly, and we're really calm and centered and grounded. But because of modern living, we often get thrown into this sympathetic state, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when that happens, we have all these stressful emotions, the adrenaline, the cortisol, and the hormones, those are all affecting us.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's creating havoc on the cells as well. So the way that we can obviously help treat that is through acupuncture and by taking people out of that sympathetic state and into the parasympathetic state so that
Mm-hmm.
our cells can heal. I thought something that was really cool was um, really there's only 3 phases a cell can be in, and it's the growth phase where they're thriving, they're living, they're healthy. There's a neutral phase, and then there's the protection phase.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and then the protection phase is when they're trying to get away from whatever is being presented to them. So that would be living in a toxic environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so many times, especially for me, and I'm sure for many of us as practitioners, we see patients come in and they're constantly in that protective mode, meaning they're in that sympathetic mode. They aren't able to live and thrive and grow and heal. So the cell is basically, it just goes back to this, that the cell is basically just a microcosm of the greater macrocosm, which is us,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
So the cell, when it's under this kind of a threat, there will be kind of a localized immune response, and then collectively our entire body will also have this state of inflammation as well. Is that kind of that way that the microcosm is affecting the macrocosm and vice versa?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Hmm.
Is it, when we're faced with environmental toxicity, how does that influence the HPA axis so that we're maybe, does that have an effect to keep us from getting into a parasympathetic state? Or does it keep us kind of wired if we're, facing these environmental stressors as well?
Exactly. It's just keeping us wired. I mean, because if you think about it, we were given the sympathetic state to allow us to run from the tiger or the lion that was chasing us,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it was supposed to be only an acute condition. So
Mm-hmm.
it worked out. So let's say your body is currently fighting an infection,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's undergoing that type of stress where there's some sort of infection, viral or bacterial going on. And then all of a sudden you were faced with having to run for your life because a wild animal was attacking you. Then your body's going to stop working on the infection and it's going to give you the necessary means
Mm-hmm.
to get out of that situation,
Mm-hmm.
right? But what's happening now is in modern society is we're constantly in that state to where our bodies aren't able to focus on keeping a healthy environment because we're constantly under attack by the adrenaline and the cortisol and all of the hormones that are being blasted at us because we aren't able to calm down and get into a healthy, calm, and resting state.
Do you think that being overly stimulated may play into this? I'm thinking of hunter-gatherer societies and just how boring they are. People are just kind of sitting around, for hours
Right.
on end, maybe doing something really mind-numbingly boring. But is there something to be said about tapping into these states of, boredom for parasympathizing?
Yeah. And why does it have to be boring? Maybe
I
it's just
guess
that
that's
we
the
we
judgment.
maybe as a society we're just so used to having everything at a certain pace that if we are just how it's supposed to be, as in one with nature and just
Mm-hmm.
being calm, then maybe that's being perceived as boring.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, and I'm thinking about that even as I say that. It reminds me of a friend of mine is an alcoholic, and for him, if you're going a few hours without having a drink, then there's no fun involved. There's no life involved. Life is involved, when there's alcohol. And I'm just thinking if we're kind of addicted to information and addicted to stimulation like this, then a few hours of just kind of vegetating is going to
Mhm.
seem as uncomfortable, if we're information addicted as it might be for an alcoholic who isn't really enjoying himself unless he's having a drink.
Right. And I think that's where you can also look at epigenetics, and we know that screen time stimulates us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the blue light that
Mm-hmm.
our cells are perceiving, and light is energy. So
Mm-hmm.
that's still energy that's affecting the cells that are creating that overstimulation.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think it's just that so many of us as a society, especially our society, are so overly stimulated at all times. And I'm sure we all have patients that they just can't let go of their screens. They can't relax when they're on the table.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have a rule where I don't allow screen time, obviously, on the table.
Mm-hmm.
But but yeah, there's a certain, percentage where they are literally stuck in
Mm-hmm.
that hyper tense alert phase, and then for them to become get into that parasympathetic phase and rest and allow their body to just decompress, they don't know what to do with it. It doesn't feel comfortable for them and they don't like it.
When people are in that protective state at a cellular level, what is that doing to the aging process? What is that doing for their state of inflammation?
They're aging more quickly. They're not
Mm-hmm.
able to reproduce healthy vibrant cells. And so the cells get sick and the reproduction of healthy cells slows down. So it is going to impact their aging. Biologically, our cells don't know if we're being chased by a bear or if we're in an argument with our partner, because we're reacting in such a way that we're stimulating our sympathetic nervous system to react, and we're getting in that fight or flight.
Okay.
And then we get locked in.
Now, what if my grandpa was chased by bears because my grandfather was chased by bears? Will that influence his epigenetics in a way that can carry over intergenerationally? And is this why I don't like bears?
Maybe. Okay, so recently, or not recently, but a couple decades ago, there was a study done in rats, of course, where they were looking at genetically identical rats, but they were given, one mother was given a very fat-laden diet, and the other mother was not. And then they had their offspring, and the one who was given a lot of the fat supplements and all this extra fat in the diet ended up having very fat offspring that had diabetes, etc. And yet the genetically identical rat that was given the lean diet had very lean offspring and healthy offspring. So that's an example of how what we do and the environment in which we are putting ourselves and putting into our bodies is affecting our offspring and further generations. So
what does it take, if, let's say, grandma ate a high-fat diet or grandma was a sniper, whatever the case may be, if that can affect people or rats down the line 2-3 generations, what does it take for us to kind of, I don't want to say clean the slate, but maybe rewire ourselves so that we can live an optimal life in the present?
I think with the new science that's coming out, it's giving us a new opportunity and allowing us to do that. I think the beauty of the new science of epigenetics in combination with quantum physics is telling us that the ancients got it right, that living in harmony with nature and by doing gentle Qigong, Tai Chi practices and using things, healing modalities such as acupuncture is very effective. Some even estimate that things like acupuncture compared to allopathic medicine like pharmaceuticals is 100 times more powerful than treating disease.
Is that because of the effect on the epigenetics?
It actually has to do a little bit more with the quantum physics and looking at energy versus particle. But still, it would be an energy signal versus a particle signal, is the hypothesis anyway.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that but what I was going to say is the key to knowing that we are not a victim of the genes that we were given, because 95% of us have a healthy genome. There's about 5% of us that are born, us meaning humans, are born with birth defects that truly have something genetically debilitating that causes illness. But the rest of the 95% of us, we have a healthy genome. So just because my father had a heart attack at 50 and my grandfather died at 50 from a heart attack doesn't mean that I am. There are ways of changing that. And it's really all about the perception is what they're finding, and changing the way we eat, the way we believe, what we believe, our perceptions in life. And so you'll notice that the happier the people are, the healthier they are. And the kind of cool thing about this was they figured out, oh, well, there has to be a happy gene, right? That these people were just born with a happy gene. And so they did find that there's a happy gene, but it wasn't that they were born with this happy gene. What they actually found was that they were able to create this happy gene just by changing their perspective. So a lot of things that I do with my patients is having them do gratitude journals and things like that. So kind of changing their perspective at all times and tweaking it to affect their health.
Do animals also create this happy gene?
I don't know about that.
If they could we eat them and take their powers?
That's an interesting concept. There is some thought, and I don't know, I'm sure you've heard about this, but, just slaughtering animals and the animals that have fear as they're going to slaughter. And if we eat those animals who experienced fear during their death, that we ingest that fear, there's some belief in that. And I haven't really gone into it, but I know that there's some people, even in our field, that take that into consideration.
I think that may be the basis between, like some of the kosher and halal ways to kill animals are supposed to be just right away so they don't feel anything. And it also makes me wonder if you kind of tickle them first before you shoot them, if that wouldn't just be like...
Aww.
No, they have this kind of duck on Qingcheng Mountain. It's this Taoist mountain in China. And it's called happy duck. And they feed the duck the tips of the herb chuanxiong. And basically the ducks are always happy and a little bit high. And when you eat these ducks, you kind of get a little bit loopy too, because it goes into the fat. It's kind of fat soluble sort of thing. So yeah, a little bit of herbal booze and happy duck is good for what ails you. It's a fast track to...
That reminds me, my boyfriend took me to this really, really nice sushi restaurant, and we had this really rare beef from Japan, and I'd never had it before. And they explained to us how it was raised and how they were just massaged every day. And it was, one piece was over $40 for just like one piece, right? And I ate it, and I had tears of joy come to my eyes, and I just had these tears trickling down my face, and I felt like a kook because I was like, oh my gosh, I'm crying, but I could just feel like this joy, like overwhelming me. It was
this
amazing.
This was also cooked in Texas, right?
It was, yeah. Well, it wasn't cooked. I mean, it wasn't cooked. It was,
it's raw.
Yeah, so it was one of those omakase really fancy places. But
okay, because I've had Texas barbecue that does that to me too, but it might just be the honey, and I don't know.
No, it wasn't the barbecue.
Okay. Neat. So are you using a combination of herbs and Qigong and acupuncture in your practice? And are you also, I don't know, smacking people across the face and telling them to think, about what they're grateful for?
I've had a few of my patients call me like Little Oprah. Because they're like, oh my gosh, you're so positive. Like, you're always making me see the other perspective of things. And I'm like, yeah, write it down. Like, start changing your perspective. So yes, I do that. I wish I could say I incorporated Qigong more, but to be honest, I don't have a good foundation. I just started Qigong myself this year. So I've only been practicing for about 8 to 9 months. And yes, I do use herbs, and yes, I do use acupuncture, primarily acupuncture.
What do you find? Do you find any crossover between people's dreams when they're in this kind of protective state versus when they're in a growth state? Is there a change in their dreams?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the key things that I ask for. And it's kind of one of the things that I always get looked at twice, because they're like, I've never had a doctor ask me specifically about the dream. Because if they have a vivid dream or if they have nightmares, then I know that there's something subconsciously going on that they might not be aware of, that's trying to come out, trying to be released or expressed, but they are under that state of stress. So it is certainly indicative of being in a stressful state and protective state, right? Because their conscious mind would be able to verbalize it. So a lot of these patients, they don't really see a correlation with what's going on. But then if they are having the vivid dreams or the nightmares, then that's a key to let me know that now there's something deeper that we need to address.
What kind of changes do you tend to see with the treatment, and how long does that typically take for people?
Everyone's different, obviously. Some people can surprise me where, I see patients with severe bipolar depression, 20, 30 years history of depression, and within 6 treatments, they feel stabilized and good, and we're able to maintain that for the next 4 to 6 months until, as they keep seeing me. Others, it's a process. And what I've noticed is when I work with my patients, my primary goal is if they're really in that sympathetic state where they're constantly under stress, they have that neck tension, their shoulder tension, their body aches, they're fighting with their spouse, they have a poor relationship or a lot of stress at work, whatever it may be, then my primary goal is to get them into that parasympathetic phase and try to just reset their nervous system every time that they come in, so that it's just an easier reset each time, and that hopefully it can stick longer and longer. So instead of feeling great for a couple hours after the session, I'm hoping eventually we can get to days, then weeks, etc., so that becomes their normal. And then whenever I notice that, this is the cool part, when we can go back to the knowledge that we've learned from the cells, is once they get into that parasympathetic phase, which is the neutral and or growth phase, then these emotions that have been buried, or these emotional traumas that have been buried since childhood or adolescence or however long, slowly start to bubble up to where there's not as much fear, which would be that protective phase. There's more of that acceptance, which would be more of that growth phase, and willingness to face it, that they can gently release it. And then that, from that perspective and from that point on, we're able to peel the onion of all these emotions that have been buried inside of them that have just wreaked havoc on their bodies for so long.
I'm just thinking about it like a tense muscle. If you're using that muscle constantly under a state of tension, it's only when you relax it and let it open up that you can really undo those knots. So, yeah, I think that's interesting, because from the point of view of the cell, you're really working with the same mechanism. It's just being expressed in different ways. And, culturally, it's interesting. When I'm thinking in Chinese, it's all kind of the same concept. When I'm thinking in English, it's almost like sequestered, your emotional life, and then a knot in your shoulder. These may be kind of like metaphors for each other, but I don't tend to think of them as really being the same thing at a cellular level. And it's ridiculous, but just as you say this, I realize that there's even this gap in understanding. So people may understand this at a musculoskeletal level, but when you speak about emotions, they may think, oh, well, now this is religious woo-woo land, but really it's working with the same system, metabolically.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I'm a heretic from both worlds in a way, because, I'm this biologist who is, completely kind of dismantling the whole way that we've been taught genetics and physics, like Newtonian physics, and to really accept this new science that's being discovered and how important it is. And then I feel like a heretic in the Chinese medicine perspective, because people are like, oh my gosh, you're so woo-woo, you're like clearing emotions, and and so I feel like I don't really know how to categorize what it is, but whatever it is, it's working. My patients are getting a lot of success, and they're feeling a lot better. And it's just, I've kind of gotten in a rhythm and a pattern of how to treat them. So over time, I've learned, okay, this I need to do what I would consider like a release pattern, and that would be working with certain set of points versus putting them into a parasympathetic state. So
it's interesting. I think oftentimes we think of relaxation and restoration as having a margarita on a beach, but after a week and a half of actual rest, then that's kind of where the deeper work can come up sometimes, and that's where the true restoration is but when that's happening, what's happening at a cellular level? Is there a difference in intracellular communication or receptor sites? Is there a retraining going on? I mean, when we're experiencing this, like I haven't thought about being chased by that bear since, for 15 years or whatever it may be. And then you finally rest a little bit, and then it sort of bubbles to the surface. Why? What's going on with that?
from a cellular level, I don't know. I can only imagine, and this is, I can't explain it from a physiological perspective. So I'd like to dive deeper into this. But what I do know is that when we allow ourselves to go into that resting state, that these emotions they dislodge. They have this ability to start to dislodge in our system so that they can be expressed. So there can be outbreaks of crying or anger. So what I found is whenever this dislodging occurs and I do a certain treatment for these patients, I'll let them know that the next 1 to 3 days they're going to feel a lot more emotional, and it's just their way of expressing it. But from a cellular level, that I don't really know. I just know that the cells start to work in harmony. I'm just thinking out loud, as the cells start to work in harmony, perhaps they're able to recognize the emotion and the trauma that it's put on the body and the disease that it's put on the body, and it's able to focus on that. And it's not really working on dealing with all these extraneous stressors. Maybe. I mean, that's kind of what's coming up. But that is something that I'd like to dive deeper into and kind of understand it from a cellular perspective. Because if we understand things from a cellular perspective, we can understand our health so much more clearly. So
awesome. So what are the top 3 pieces of advice that you give your patients?
Well, if they have a crappy diet, change their diet. So I'll categorize these together. What we put into our body and what we put onto our body. So diet, food and drink is important. So I'll discuss that. And then in conjunction with that, I talk about, especially for women, cosmetics that we use, bath and body products, because so much of that is so toxic, and we're putting it on our face and, on a daily basis. And I don't know if y'all have been to Texas, but we wear a lot of makeup there, and how that affects our bodies. So definitely going over that. Number 2 is working on, like I said, working on changing their perspective. and finding the positive. I think what resonates most with my patients is I have an empathy for them
Mm-hmm.
because I've been through a lot of trauma in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, it was just recently. And so they kind of had a hint of what was going on in my personal life versus, I always remain professional, but there was still this understanding that it was like, okay, she's been through a lot of stuff and so she can empathize. And
Mm-hmm.
so I feel like if I'm able to overcome this and come out so much stronger, then that's such a strength and I can be a positive role model for them.
Mm-hmm.
And then I give them, so looking at things from a positive perspective, regardless of how horrible it may seem at the time. So that would be number two. And then number three is just the importance of doing the acupuncture and really just trying to get into that parasympathetic state because otherwise your body can't heal itself. And ultimately, that's our goal. Our bodies want to heal, and it
Mm-hmm.
has the capacity to do that. We just have to put it into an environment that it's able to do that.
Awesome. Where can people learn more about your work and find you as patients?
So I have a practice in Houston, Texas. It's in the River Oaks area. They can find me on Facebook at Phoenix Rising Acupuncture. They can find me at Instagram, Phoenix Rising Acupuncture, and then my
Mm-hmm.
website is phoenixrisingacu.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on and enlightening me as to how cells relate to emotions. I'd never really thought of it like that. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me. A pharmaceutical or some sort of medical intervention
Mm-hmm.
was the cause of death. It was the number three, but they estimated that that was really conservative numbers. And a few years later, Dr. Gary Null looked at the study more extensively, and they found that it was actually the number one cause of all deaths in the United States. So the point there is that something's not working, and if they knew how our bodies really worked,
Mm-hmm.
then the medicine would work,
Yeah, I think that's
right?
fair enough, right? Yeah.
So there wouldn't be so many side effects, adverse
Mm-hmm.
events, and deaths.
Mm.
So we don't have that many side effects. We don't have that many adverse events, and we hardly ever have deaths from acupuncture.
Mm-hmm.
And is that because we truly understand in the ancient Chinese truly understood how the body worked, even more so than what Western medicine is basing their whole medicine on.
Mm.
So it's pretty cool.
Yeah,
But yeah.
absolutely. I've been looking at the, of course, as much research as we can find with that. And everything that is coming out seems to reinforce some of these ideas that are more ancient, even ones that I thought, well, that maybe was just a metaphor. And then a few years later, some research comes out and says, no, that was not a metaphor. That is literally what's happening. So I get really
Mhm.
excited. I think it's a really wonderful time to be alive when, science is overlapping so much with what people were discovering and mastering 1,000 years ago and longer.
Yeah. Well, and because here's the key. The key is that they understood that we're just a microcosm of the greater macrocosm. So it's all about living in harmony. Just like the cell is a microcosm of us as a macrocosm,
Mm-hmm.
it it just keeps going. So as long as we're living in harmony with nature, that's the
Mm-hmm.
key,
Mm. It's
you know?
interesting because again with like the sequestered brain, if I'm thinking of outer space, then outer space has these gravitational forces, these energetic forces, and gases and all of this kind of stuff. And then when I think of cells, like really small, you have these kind of electrons going around, but then magically when it comes to the human body, which is somewhere in between these two, then we're supposed to not consider that there's any sort of energetic connection going on, even though it's happening at the very smallest levels, and even though it's happening at the very largest levels. it's almost like we're supposed to shut down that part of our mind that says,
Yeah.
There's this, there are these forces even that are not that well understood, like gravity and, many others as well. And what are they all? I don't know.
Right.
It's worth looking into.
Right. And that's the whole point of, when you put the epigenetics and you put the quantum physics together, and you realize that we are just energy, because when you get down to it, what's smaller than a cell is a molecule, what's smaller than a molecule is an atom, what's in an atom is basically space. And then we have these electrons and protons, but really it's just space. And so, it's looking at quantum physics versus the Newtonian, and the Newtonian is only dealing with matter, but, yeah, I mean, there's just so much information. And I think the cool thing about it is that the more breakthroughs we're having in science, the more it's bringing us back to what we, I don't want to say what we've been taught, because, for instance, the Chinese medicine that I was taught has a very Western medicine push to it, right? But really going back to the origins of Chinese medicine, it's really colliding, and it's working out perfectly and saying, hey, they had it right all along.
If you'd like to receive an email from me on the show content, references, and contact information for our amazing guests, then you'll want to go to botanicalbiohacking.com. Scroll all the way to the bottom of the page. There you can sign up for our email, like our Facebook page, and rate us on Stitcher or iTunes, all in one convenient location. Thanks again for listening to the Botanical Biohacking Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Miles.